Hello everyone and welcome to this video where you see a huge amount of Alta vehicles, including the very first rail vehicle I've ever made, which is actually this Highrail truck, but we're going to get into that in a bit. Regardless, with these locomotives coming to the workshop soon here, I also have to create some rolling stock. We can't just have these locomotives. Yes, they are functional with each other, but I don't want to release them until there's at least a couple of cars that can go with it. I love to engage my Discord community and ask questions and sort of take their opinions, advice sometimes. And in this case, there were a lot of great suggestions for various types of train cars that can be released, and some of them will even make it to the release of the locomotive. So thank you to everybody that's given good advice here. I do have a lot of ideas myself and ideas that I've worked with my Discord moderators and admins. So we're going to take a look at some of them and how we can implement them to the release. Some of you may remember seeing this container car that I released with the train for the testing. I did revamp it a little bit. I've added some lights that can flash if the emergency brake is triggered on the car itself. Of course, the emergency brake on the rolling stock or on the train car does communicate with the lead locomotive. So in a case where you have a bunch of these and someone triggers the emergency stop on the rolling stock, it will stop the whole train. So it does act like an emergency brake system. It doesn't really differentiate between locomotives and rolling stock. You can't disable it, so if you are playing with friends who want to bother you or annoy you, they may be able to turn this and it'll stop the train. That is for emergency purposes only, guys. The light will flash if that gets triggered on the car that triggered it. So then when you have the inspector going around and checking every car, they can see exactly which car triggered it and make sure that it is fixed. Now in this case, you can see that it has the same hitch connector, the similar style that I've been kind of rolling with on these creations. And what you'll notice is down here, there's actually the main train microcontroller. So it is a little clunky, and I'm gonna retrofit this because I don't want all this logic to be on every single train car. It's gonna slow the game down, it's gonna lag, these processes are not needed for it. So first, what I'm going to do is extract here what is needed and what isn't needed for the rolling stock. It can be quite as simple as just removing things we don't need. We don't need this, we do need brakes. And then in here, I just got to start deleting things that don't have anything connected to them. With some rework, we ended up with this microcontroller. You could see how much simpler it is. I deleted all the things we don't really need. The main thing that a rolling stock has to be able to do is brake. The rest of the functions, there's no throttle, there's nothing else. It's pretty much just brake and not brake. So I did add a toggle switch here, which is gonna set the brakes on if it's not connected to something. So if it is in fact connected to something, then the brakes will be disengaged, letting it roll, or you can hop aboard and turn off these brakes. Spawning it in, you could see that this is on, meaning that these wheels should be locked up. You could see brakes are 1. Now if I turn this off, brakes should now be 0, and I should be free to be able to push it around. Now that they are connected, in theory, there should be data passing through these nodes. So this is reading 0, but if I turn on this brake, this should still be reading 0 because it's connected. Now, if I disconnect it, this should read 1. If I reconnect it, it should read 0. Perfect. Now, we're going to fire up the locomotive and start to move. And what I'm going to do is apply the brake. Now, I'm going to apply the brake maybe at 70% or so, and if we take a look at the locomotive's brakes, you could see here that they are 0.55. If we look at these, there's 0, so that is no good. So this has to be revisited this should be communicating. Oh, actually, it's not, because the brakes are not on the automatic mode. They're currently independent brakes, meaning our locomotive is braking independently. Turn that on, and then run back to that trailer, and it should be 0.55. And it's not. So, we got a mistake here. So I solved the problem, and now you could see that the brakes are in fact at 0.55. How did I do it? Well, this locomotive had to be set to master mode. Keep in mind, when it's set to master mode, that is now feeding information to any other locomotives and or rail cars. The problem with that is, what if you're just towing a few trailers or a few cars and you have one single locomotive? You're not going to be engaging the master locomotive mode because there are no slaved locomotives. So in this instant, it doesn't make sense to have to turn that on. So this trailer or car or rail car or rolling stock should actually be able to differentiate the fact it is in fact a rolling stock rather than being a train. So now in this case, we're actually taking the information that is being fed from this train and receiving it here in our microcontroller. The problem is that the brake value is not even being received in this instant because it's not being sent from the master locomotive or from the locomotive itself. So the microcontroller in the locomotive end actually needs to be adjusted in order for it to control all the rolling stock in the instant you have one locomotive and no other trains in that train, so you're not going to be turning on that master button. A quick and easy fix for that in the locomotive's microcontroller would actually be to create a different node for the brakes that are being sent to the rolling stock. So the rolling stock now will actually take the brake command from a different source, a different channel altogether, and we can set that channel. And if you take a look here at this microcontroller, you could see the brakes that we're applying here go in through all of this stuff and end up here attaching to the brakes. But in addition to that, they're being fed to this switch box and then being fed over here to what we see is our active channel 2, 1, 2. So that is the brakes. Now that's the brakes that are being sent to the other locomotives. So what I can do is take a look here at my master list, and you can see channel 2 is brakes. I can actually add a channel 2 brakes or channel 3 brakes now for the rail cars. So stock, and then here I'm going to put loco. So now the rolling stock gets its own channel that is feeding the brakes, and if I go up here and set it to that, and just by adding another channel here, we can now feed whatever brake system we want into the other rail cars. Now I just have to be very careful because I don't want the brakes to be applied from various locomotives. I still want it to only be applied by the master locomotive or the one in charge or the one that's on with the key. So what we do know is that we actually have a key output, but we have a key input as well. So that key input, if I could find it somewhere here, is actually what's setting this locomotive apart from other locomotives. Now, of course, that gets a little muddied because you can technically manually start your other slaved locomotives. So while that would be a valid way to look at it, it actually may not be the best one. However, as a starting point, I am going to just attach the direct brake line that is braking our locomotive to this node here for channel 3. So anytime our locomotive's brakes are toggled, now our channel 3 is going to be pressed pretty much. Or not, it's not toggled, it's Boolean, but anytime the brakes are applied, they'll also be applied on that other rail car. So with that channel 3 now set here, we could now go into the other microcontroller belonging to the rolling stock. And now all we do is up here set the channel that is going to be read to channel 3. So now channel 3 should be coming directly from that locomotive and feeding it no matter what, even if we don't have that button applied. With the new versions now applied here in this model, what I can do is go up here and now turn on this locomotive. You can see the brakes are fully applied. I'm going to set them to around 50% here. And of course we have to turn on automatic brakes. And now we don't have the master mode on. But regardless, you can see here these brakes are 44 and these are also 44. So in this case the system is working without having to set it to master mode. So that would be pretty much what we're looking for. Now we have to test something else. What happens if we add another locomotive into this mix? Meaning if we now have a master and a slaved locomotive and we are trying to get the brake value from the master only, what happens? Because now we're kind of bypassing that whole system. So you can see that one started up now. What I'm saying is we're bypassing the system of using the master and the slaved locomotives for feeding information to these rail cars. So you can see now that this one is still reading that 0.44, which is good. Now our slaved locomotive should be reading that exact same value as you just saw. Now up here we do have this brake set to 0. What if I apply 11? Is the rolling stock now going to have the 0.44 that we see here plus the 11? It does not. Perfect. So that means that whatever the slaved locomotive is set to isn't even being transmitted into the rolling stock, and we don't have to have that primary button turned on, because again, if you are not towing a second locomotive and you only have the one, you don't want to have to set it to being the master. It just doesn't make any sense. That system is only designed if you have two locomotives kind of in sequence. It just goes to show that even when you think a system is fully good to go, until you do that trial run, you really won't know what exactly is going on. So in this case, we have to have that bypass for our simple trains or simple rolling stocks. Now the last test that has to be done here is if we have only two of these things in sequence, what is going to happen? The reason why testing two locomotives attached like this is important, because we were feeding information through that container car, feeding it to the locomotive behind. So any data was stripped because of that connection. But in this case, we now have two locomotives attached directly to each other. Each one of them has their brakes default set on. So when you spawn these things, you'll notice that this brake is fully set on and it stays on in whatever locomotive is the slaved locomotive. So then in that case, the primary here, in theory, reducing this should also turn down that brake there. But let's see what happens, because what we're going to do now is turn down this brake. But keep in mind, because that locomotive is just kind of attached behind us, ours is going to have that 50%. Over here, it's still going to have 1. It's still registering whatever is being fed through that system. So you have two choices at this point. And of course, I didn't even turn on the automatic brakes, but regardless, that's still what you're going to get. You're going to get the 0.56 here, and over here it'll still be 1. Why is that? Because this train here is acting fully like just something rolling around. All right, the rolling stock, when it's connected, the brakes disengage. When a locomotive is connected, the brakes will not disengage. So if you plan on just towing a locomotive, you have to manually set the brakes off. In this case, you can see now there's 0, and they won't break. So in this case, this unit is just a dumb unit, and it's even worse than that because it is not even breaking when a rolling stock would actually be breaking in this instance. But there is a way to fix that, and it's back to the microcontroller of the locomotive. So if you pay attention here, you could see that we have the key input and we have the key output. The key output is something that gets controlled when the locomotive is turned on, either automatically turned on, meaning it's in slave mode, or turned on by the key in the locomotive unit because someone wants to drive it. So those are the two options or two scenarios where the key is turned on. There is not a third, meaning if the key is turned off or the output is not on, then I do want this locomotive to act and behave like a simple rolling stock. But we can't make it into a blanket statement saying if the key is not on, then the brakes are whatever comes from channel 3. The problem with saying something like that is now if the locomotive is off, the brakes will be disengaged, and we don't have space to put in those front and rear connectors, so there is not a way to determine if the connectors are on or off. So we're kind of just stuck with trying something else, which in this case, it's not perfect, but at least it'll get the job done in the very odd case that you're just towing a locomotive without trying to use it as a slaved locomotive. So if you're just trying to tow it, you don't want the engine on, then what we'll do is we'll actually read and add to the brakes. So the problem there is if you have the brakes a little engaged, then you're just adding to them. But this should be, I think, fine for, well, no, so then what you have to do is not have the brakes engaged on that locomotive. You have to then make sure you've put it to 0. So keep in mind, if you're towing a locomotive, you're going to want to set it to 0. But what we'll do here is extract that number that's coming from this over here, and put it into our on. So if this is not on, then we're going to be feeding it from this signal. So I just put it over here. It's reading channel 3, and over here we're going to be feeding that into this that we've added. So again, if this is not on, if the key input is not on, then we're just adding whatever value is coming out of A plus B of channel 3 to this system here. So to run the same test here, we're going to turn this one on. We'll set the brake to like 50 or whatever, and of course we have to apply the automatic brakes. It's not in slave mode, meaning the locomotive behind us is not on, only this is on, and you can see here it says 0.58. Over here, we're going to be hitting 1 plus 0.58. Now, of course, the brakes max out at 1, so that really doesn't do anything. But because the engines are off in this unit, all you got to do is turn this down. So that's the one requirement. You're trying to tow a locomotive, you got to turn the brakes off in the locomotive. But over here now, you are feeding the data that you are sending from this one over there. Of course, that all changes, or it should change once we turn that on. Now, of course, this now will be the same as this one here, so that nothing's changed in that terms, but you'll note that even if we put this all the way back to 1, the fact that it is in slave mode, it will not be registering 1.58. So that change only really will come if you're trying to tow a locomotive as dead weight rather than using it as a slaved locomotive. So the changes there in the locomotives don't affect our container car here, which is probably going to be the first thing that will be released with the trains. I'll see if I develop some other ones, but now you could see that we've gotten it working together, which is the biggest challenge. Of course, now this microcontroller is much smaller, much more optimized, and should not be trying to lag your game down if you don't have the strongest PC, which is the whole purpose of why I've done this for this type of rolling stock. Now, we did say we're going to take a look at that Highrail truck. Now, this truck was developed at a time when, believe it or not, you could actually disconnect the truck from the track by applying this crazy force that just shoots the whole thing up and ends up using a bunch of pistons, a bunch of systems, and in essence allows the truck to leave the track. Now, since then, the developers have actually disabled that, so no matter what kind of force you apply now, you physically cannot disconnect yourself from the track. You can no longer leave the track. So you're on it once, you're off it, you're on it forever. I do intend on making a video talking about that and kind of looking at the pros and cons of that type of system. But what it does is it renders this truck pretty much useless with the use of these pneumatic pistons and whatever. Plus, we have this super outdated interior, super outdated system. So what I figure is we're going to throw this setup on a regular truck now, my updated series, which has received a lot of work. Of course, the totally changed interior, as well as options and whatnot. So we're going to put the Highrail system on one of these trucks with the caveat that once the Highrail system is applied, you're just now a rail vehicle. But it lets you travel around the map, and you could use it as a rail vehicle, you just can't disconnect it from the track. So I will be updating one of these. First and foremost, the newest rodeo is going to get my gas relief valve gas tank that I talked about in the other videos. So that is obviously needed in order to get the vehicle working properly. So that will be applied to all of my vehicles with time. But now with that, we can put on that Highrail system. What we're going to pluck from this version is this whole setup minus the pivot that is supposed to rotate it to break free. So it's just going to drop up and down. So the advantage is you can spawn it, drive it to a point you want to connect to the track, and then connect it to that track. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility and freedom when it comes to utilizing the rail system. So that's going to continue off camera, but pretty much now you can see the final touches of the Alta rail system are kind of coming all together. I'm quite excited to have the rail edition for transportation, for the logistics side of things. It's going to make things a lot easier and more fun in the game. So stay tuned for all that. Thank you for watching this video. Stay tuned for more content, more creations, and as always, happy Stormworksing, everyone.